The Eternal Husband. Chapter 1. Velchaninoff. The summer had come, and, contrary to expectations, Velchaninoff remained in Petersburg. The trip he had planned to the south of Russia had fallen through, and the end of his case was not in sight. This case, a lawsuit concerning an estate, had taken a very unfortunate turn. 3 months earlier it had appeared to be quite straightforward, almost impossible to contest. But suddenly everything was changed. "And in fact everything has changed for the worse." Velchaninoff began frequently and resentfully repeating that phrase to himself. He was employing an adroit, expensive, and distinguished lawyer, and was not sparing money. But through impatience and lack of confidence he had been tempted to meddle in the case himself, too. He read documents and wrote statements which the lawyer rejected point-blank, ran from one court to another, collected evidence, and probably hindered everything. The lawyer complained at any rate, and tried to pack him off to a summer villa. But Velchaninoff could not even make up his mind to go away. The dust, the stifling heat, the white nights of Petersburg that always fret the nerves were what he was enjoying in town. His flat was near the Grand Theatre. He had only recently taken it, and it too was a failure. "Everything is a failure," he thought. His nervousness increased every day, but he had for a long time past been subject to nervousness and hypochondria. He was a man whose life had been full and varied. He was by no means young, 38 or even 39, and his old age, as he expressed it himself, had come upon him quite unexpectedly. But he realized himself that he had grown older less by the number than by the quality, so to say, of his years, and that if he had begun to be aware of waning powers, the change was rather from within than from without. In appearance he was still strong and hearty. He was a tall, sturdily built fellow, with thick flaxen hair without a sign of grayness, and a long fair beard almost halfway down his chest. At first sight he seemed somewhat slack and clumsy, but if you looked more attentively you would detect at once that he was a man of excellent breeding, who had at some time received the education of an aristocrat. Velchaninoff's manners were still free, assured, and even gracious, in spite of his acquired grumpiness and slackness. And he was still, even now, full of the most unhesitating, the most snobbishly insolent self-confidence, the depth of which he did not himself suspect, although he was a man not merely intelligent, but even sometimes sensible, almost cultured and unmistakably gifted. His open and ruddy face had been in old days marked by a feminine softness of complexion which attracted the notice of women. And even now some people, looking at him, would say, "What a picture of health! What a complexion!" And yet this picture of health was cruelly subject to nervous depression. His eyes were large and blue. 10 years earlier they had possessed great fascination. They were so bright, so gay, so careless that they could not but attract everyone who came in contact with him. Now that he was verging on the 40s, the brightness and good humor were almost extinguished. Those eyes, which were already surrounded by tiny wrinkles, had begun to betray the cynicism of a worn-out man of doubtful morals, a duplicity, an ever-increasing irony, and another shade of feeling which was new, a shade of sadness and of pain, a sort of absent-minded sadness, as though about nothing in particular, and yet acute. This sadness was especially marked when he was alone. And, strange to say, this man, who had been only a couple of years before fond of noisy gaiety, careless and good-humored, who had been so capital a teller of funny stories, liked nothing now so well as being absolutely alone. He purposely gave up a great number of acquaintances whom he need not have given up even now, in spite of his financial difficulties. It is true that his vanity counted for something in this. With his vanity and mistrustfulness, he could not have endured the society of his old acquaintances. But by degrees, in solitude, even his vanity began to change its character. It grew no less, quite the contrary indeed, but it began to develop into a special sort of vanity which was new in him. It began at times to suffer from different causes, from unexpected causes which would have formerly been quite inconceivable, from causes of a higher order than ever before. If one may use such an expression, if there really are higher or lower causes. This he added on his own account. Yes, he had even come to that. He was worrying about some sort of higher ideas of which he would never have thought twice in earlier days. In his own mind and in his conscience he called higher all ideas at which, he found to his surprise, he could not laugh in his heart. There had never been such hitherto. In his secret heart only, of course. Oh, in company it was a different matter. He knew very well indeed that, if only the occasion were to arise, he would the very next day, in spite of all the mysterious and reverent resolutions of his conscience, with perfect composure, disavow all these higher ideas, and would be the first to turn them into ridicule, without, of course, admitting anything. And this was really the case, in spite of a certain, and indeed considerable, independence of thought, which he had of late gained at the expense of the lower ideas that had mastered him till then. And how often, when he got up in the morning, he began to be ashamed of the thoughts and feelings he had passed through during a sleepless night. And he had suffered continually of late from sleeplessness. He had noticed for some time past that he had become excessively sensitive about everything, trifles as well as matters of importance, and so he made up his mind to trust his feelings as little as possible. But he could not overlook some facts, the reality of which he was forced to admit. Of late his thoughts and sensations were sometimes at night completely transformed, and for the most part utterly unlike those which came to him in the early part of the day. This struck him, and he even consulted a distinguished doctor, who was, however, an acquaintance. He spoke to him about it jocosely, of course. The answer he received was that the transformation of ideas and sensations, and even the possession of two distinct sets of thoughts and sensations, was a universal fact among persons who think and feel, that the convictions of a whole lifetime were sometimes transformed under the melancholy influences of night and sleeplessness. Without rhyme or reason, most momentous decisions were taken. But all this, of course, was only true up to a certain point. And in fact, if the subject were too conscious of the double nature of his feelings, so that it began to be a source of suffering to him, it was certainly a symptom of approaching illness. And then steps must be taken at once. The best thing of all was to make a radical change in the mode of life, to alter one's diet, or even to travel. Relaxing medicine was beneficial, of course. Velchaninoff did not care to hear more, but to his mind it was conclusively shown to be illness. And so all this is only illness. All these higher ideas are mere illness and nothing more, he sometimes exclaimed to himself resentfully. He was very loath to admit this. Soon, however, what had happened exclusively in the hours of the night began to be repeated in the morning, only with more bitterness than at night, with anger instead of remorse, with irony instead of emotion. What really happened was that certain incidents in his past, even in his distant past, began suddenly, and God knows why, to come more and more frequently back to his mind. But they came back in quite a peculiar way. Velchaninoff had, for instance, complained for a long time past of loss of memory. He would forget the faces of acquaintances who were offended by his cutting them when they met. He sometimes completely forgot a book he had read months before. And yet, in spite of this loss of memory, evident every day, and a source of great uneasiness to him, everything concerning the remote past, things that had been quite forgotten for 10 or 15 years, would sometimes come suddenly into his mind now with such amazing exactitude of details and impressions that he felt as though he were living through them again. Some of the facts he remembered had been so completely forgotten that it seemed to him a miracle that they could be recalled. But this was not all. And indeed, what man of wide experience has not some memory of a peculiar sort? But the point was that all that was recalled came back now with quite a fresh, surprising, and till then inconceivable point of view, and seemed as though someone were leading up to it on purpose. Why did some things he remembered strike him now as positive crimes? And it was not a question of the judgments of his mind only. He would have put little faith in his gloomy, solitary, and sick mind. But it reached the point of curses and almost of tears, of inward tears. Why, 2 years before he would not have believed it if he had been told that he would ever shed tears. At first, however, what he remembered was rather of a mortifying than of a sentimental character. He recalled certain failures and humiliations in society. He remembered, for instance, how he had been slandered by an intriguing fellow, and in consequence refused admittance to a certain house. How, for instance, and not so long ago, he had been publicly and unmistakably insulted, and had not challenged the offender to a duel. How in a circle of very pretty women he had been made the subject of an extremely witty epigram and had found no suitable answer. He even recollected 1 or 2 unpaid debts, trifling ones, it is true, but debts of honor, owing to people whom he had given up visiting and even spoke ill of. He was also worried, but only in his worst moments, by the thought of the 2 fortunes, both considerable ones, which he had squandered in the stupidest way possible. But soon he began to remember things of a higher order. Suddenly, for instance, apropos of nothing, he remembered the forgotten, utterly forgotten figure of a harmless, grey-headed, and absurd old clerk, whom he had once, long, long ago, and with absolute impunity, insulted in public, simply to gratify his own conceit, simply for the sake of an amusing and successful jest, which was repeated and increased his prestige. The incident had been so completely forgotten that he could not even recall the old man's surname, though all the surroundings of the incident rose before his mind with incredible clearness. He distinctly remembered that the old man was defending his daughter, who was unmarried, though no longer quite young, and had become the subject of gossip in the town. The old man had begun to answer angrily, but he suddenly burst out crying before the whole company, which made some sensation. They had ended by making him drunk with champagne as a joke and getting a hearty laugh out of it. And now when, apropos of nothing, Velchaninoff remembered how the poor old man had sobbed and hidden his face in his hands like a child, it suddenly seemed to him as though he had never forgotten it. And, strange to say, it had all seemed to him very amusing at the time, especially some of the details, such as the way he had covered his face with his hands, but now it was quite the contrary. Later he recalled how, simply as a joke, he had slandered the very pretty wife of a schoolmaster, and how the slander had reached the husband's ears. Velchaninoff had left the town soon after, and never knew what the final consequences of his slander had been. But now he began to imagine how all might have ended. And there is no knowing to what lengths his imagination might not have gone, if this memory had not suddenly been succeeded by a much more recent reminiscence of a young girl of the working class, to whom he had not even felt attracted, and of whom, it must be admitted, he was actually ashamed. Yet, though he could not have said what had induced him, he had got her into trouble, and had simply abandoned her and his child without even saying good-bye. It was true he had no time to spare when he left Petersburg. He had tried to find that girl for a whole year afterwards, but he had not succeeded in tracing her. He had, it seemed, hundreds of such reminiscences, and each one of them seemed to bring dozens of others in its train. By degrees his vanity, too, began to suffer. We have said already that his vanity had degenerated into something peculiar. That was true. At moments, rare moments, however, he even forgot himself to such a degree that he ceased to be ashamed of not keeping his own carriage, that he trudged on foot from one court to another, that he began to be somewhat negligent in his dress. And if someone of his own acquaintance had scanned him with a sarcastic stare in the street, or had simply refused to recognize him, he might really have had pride enough to pass him by without a frown. His indifference would have been genuine, not assumed for effect. Of course, this was only at times. These were only the moments of forgetfulness and nervous irritation. Yet his vanity had by degrees grown less concerned with the subjects that had once affected it, and was becoming concentrated on one question which haunted him continually. "Why, one would think," he began reflecting satirically sometimes, and he almost always began by being satirical when he thought about himself. "Why, one would think someone up aloft were anxious for the reformation of my morals, and were sending me these cursed reminiscences and tears of repentance. So be it, but it's all useless. It is all shooting with blank cartridge. As though I did not know for certain, more certainly than certainty, that in spite of these fits of tearful remorse and self-reproach, I haven't a grain of independence for all my foolish middle age. Why, if the same temptation were to turn up tomorrow, if circumstances, for instance, were to make it to my interest to spread a rumour that the schoolmaster's wife had taken presents from me, I should certainly spread it. I shouldn't hesitate. And it would be even worse, more loathsome than the first time, just because it would be the second time and not the first time. Yes, if I were insulted again this minute by that little prince whose leg I shot off 11 years ago, though he was the only son of his mother, I should challenge him at once and condemn him to crutches again. So they are no better than blank cartridges, and there's no sense in them. And what's the good of remembering the past when I've not the slightest power of escaping from myself?" And though the adventure with the schoolmaster's wife was not repeated, though he did not condemn anyone else to crutches, the very idea that it inevitably would be the same if the same circumstances arose almost killed him. At times. One cannot in reality suffer from memories all the time. One can rest and enjoy oneself in the intervals. So, indeed, Velchaninoff did. He was ready to enjoy himself in the intervals. Yet his sojourn in Petersburg grew more and more unpleasant as time went on. July was approaching. Intermittently he had flashes of determination to give up everything, the lawsuit and all, and to go away somewhere without looking back. To go suddenly, on the spur of the moment, to the Crimea, for instance. But as a rule, an hour later he had scorned the idea and had laughed at it. "These hateful thoughts won't stop short at sending me to the south if once they've begun and I've any sense of decency. And so it's useless to run away from them, and indeed there's no reason to." "And what's the object of running away?" he went on brooding in his despondency. "It's so dusty here, so stifling. Everything in the house is so messy. In those law courts where I hang about among those busy people, there is such a scurrying to and fro like mice, such a mass of sordid cares. All the people left in town, all the faces that flit by from morning till night so naively and openly betray their self-love, their guileless insolence, the cowardice of their little souls, the chicken-heartedness of their little natures. Why, it's a paradise for a melancholy man, seriously speaking. Everything is open, everything is clear. No one thinks it necessary to hide anything as they do among our gentry in our summer villas or at watering places abroad. And so it's more deserving of respect, if only for its openness and simplicity. I won't go away. I'll stay here if I burst."